Thanks very much. Education, the word education only comes up 2 times in the actual text of the Green New Deal, but I think in some ways it underlies a lot of what is at issue in that document. The first mention is in a list of many things which are inaccessible to far too many Americans, and it's listed in there along with long life expectancy, clean water, healthcare, housing, and transportation. And the second mention of education in the text of the Green New Deal is just as one of the bedrock services that government would need to deliver to people in order to mobilize people to the degree that the Green New Deal says should happen. I mean, the essence of that document is the idea that we're going to have something on the order of World War II or the Great Depression hit us, and all of the resources of government need to be mobilized in order to deal with that problem. So even though it isn't mentioned a lot of times in the actual text of the document, I think it's among the things that would be necessary to pull this off if it was a feasible endeavor in the first place. That's probably enough for a preamble. The most important thing about this panel are the panelists. And I'd like to tell you a little bit about who they are, their credentials, and then we'll jump right into what I hope are some of the more interesting questions about higher education from a policy standpoint in the US. So I'll start with Max Eden. He is a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute, and his research focus is school choice and federal education policy. His work has appeared in scholarly and popular outlets, the Journal of School Choice, the Encyclopedia of Education, Economics, and Finance, the Washington Post, the National Review, and the Weekly Standard. He has a BA in history from Yale University. Go Bulldogs. Sandy Baum is a senior fellow at the Urban Institute, and she's a professor emerita of economics at Skidmore College. Her research focuses on higher education finance. And since 2002, she has co-authored the College Board's annual publications, Trends in Student Aid and Trends in College Pricing. She's also the author of Student Debt, Rhetoric and Realities of Higher Education Financing, and co-author of Making College Work, Pathways to Success for Disadvantaged Students. She earned her BA in Sociology from Bryn Mawr College and her PhD in Economics right here. David Bergeron is a senior fellow for post-secondary education at the Center for American Progress. He previously served the U.S. Department of Education as the Education Secretary's chief advisor on higher education issues and administered $3 billion worth of grant and loan programs given annually to institutions of higher education and community-based organizations. Bergeron has a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science and Sociology from the University of Rhode Island. So I'm just going to kick it off right away with one of the issues we hear brought up in almost every Democratic primary debate and almost every Democratic primary stump speech, and that's free college. Elizabeth Warren mentions it all the time. Bernie Sanders brought it up just last week. Free college for all makes for a great slogan. Is it actually a great idea? I'll start with Max.
Yeah. So I'm of 2 minds when it comes to free college. There's kind of the economically liberal mind that's in favor of it, or that's against it, and then there's the social, conservative, populist part of me that's for it. Now that's kind of the inverse of what you would expect somebody to say. The economically liberal part of it, I'm against it because it would be a disaster for low-income students, right? We make public colleges free. That's going to disproportionately draw students from private universities to public universities. Public colleges will not be able to raise more revenue from the students vis-a-vis loans. They'll only be able to rely on revenue from the state. State funding might not, and almost certainly will not, keep up with the level of demand and the level of costs that continue to rise. So that means you'll either see rationing, in which case I suspect that low-income students will get the short end of the stick, or cuts to quality, in which case also low-income disadvantaged students would get the short end of the stick. So if we want to promote economic mobility, opportunity for low-income students, the way to do that is to allow schools to help them subsidize their own education vis-a-vis a loan system. Now, from my cultural conservative, kind of populist bent, I'm somewhat in favor of free college because if I wanted to destroy college, this is how I would do it. 2/3 of Republicans think that college is a bad thing for America. Not just that it's not a good thing, but that it's a bad thing. I've become rather increasingly persuaded of this myself for reasons we can maybe go into later. But if I wanted to destroy college, I would make colleges entirely dependent on state aid. I would do something that would squeeze out private colleges to start a kind of death spiral. And then once public colleges are entirely dependent on state aid, that's game over, right? Because the states aren't going to continue to prioritize higher education vis-a-vis Medicare spending, vis-a-vis K-12 spending, and nor should they, because it's the most regressive form of redistribution of all these social programs. So if the long-term plan is this kind of like Steve Bannon, destroy the universities, take back the culture, kick all these crazy leftists out of the ivory tower, and let students be guided by their parents once again, then I think I'm for free college in the mid to long run.
If I'd known that you were coming here with a secret plan to destroy college, I would have led with that. Sandy, I've heard that you're also pretty skeptical of free college for all, but not because you'd like to wreck it.
I am very skeptical of free college for all. I sort of, the first half maybe of what you said, I thought, oh, and then, okay. And let me just say that your Yale degree, I'm sure, helps you to make better judgments about many things, but I think telling other people they don't get one because college is worthless is, anyway. So free college, I mean, to me, we're having a conversation about make it free without talking about what it is. And obviously, it costs a lot of money to create educational programs and environments that really serve students well. And so the idea that what matters is that it's free, it totally ignores what it is that we're trying to offer students. And what always strikes me is that if you look at the tuition and fee price on average for public 4-year universities now, it's about almost $11,000. I think that's much too high. I think we need to do something about it. But the idea that we haven't had enough funding and therefore the price has gone up to $11,000, let's make it zero. That just doesn't sound like a reasonable way for policy to be designed. The vast majority of students from low-income backgrounds already pay zero tuition at community colleges, and more than half of them pay zero tuition at public 4-year colleges. On the other hand, students from affluent families pay a lot of tuition. Many of them pay that $10,000, $11,000. So if we just say nobody has to pay any tuition, we're saying, okay, you low-income people, this doesn't affect you. You already pay zero. But you high-income people, we're going to spend a lot of money making sure it's free for you, even though, as you said, we might not have enough money left to create really high-quality educational opportunities for all the people who can benefit from them. So my real objection is that this is not a progressive policy. I want to make sure that students from low-income backgrounds can not only cover their tuition and fees, but can live reasonably while they're in school. And free tuition doesn't do that. Students who don't pay tuition borrow lots of money, and they borrow lots of money to live. So let's make sure that we make higher education possible, quality higher education possible for the lower half of the income distribution before we say somehow we're going to pay for it for everybody.
Now, David, you at American Progress, you've written some about a proposal called College for All. Yep. And I'm wondering, I have two questions about that. First, how does that differ from either the Warren or the Sanders proposal being kicked around in the election debates? And second, how does it avoid, if it does, any of the pitfalls that Sandy or Max discussed just now?
Yeah. So our College for All proposal when I was at the Center for American Progress, kind of full time, really was calling for students to have their aid eligibility determination of whether they were low income and therefore should be subsidized through grants, or upper income where they would receive tax benefits and loans principally, that be done using the tax system, and then loans would be repaid through wage withholding rather than with students making actual payments. Our wage withholding proposal was voluntary in the sense that students who elected to use the wage withholding system would have a lower interest rate than somebody who decided to write a check every month. But that was the structure of the proposal, and that was really trying to reform the federal student financial aid system to streamline the delivery of benefits. That was very much at the heart of what we were trying to accomplish there. I think that, from my perspective, having been spending the last couple of years in semi-retirement and spending a lot of time on college campuses in a variety of ways, I've come to think that we really need to be moving beyond that conversation about reforming the financial aid system to make it work better for today's students, and really begin to say, well, how did we get away from a higher education system that was largely free? When I went to college in the 1970s, the state of Rhode Island, where I went to school, provided a tremendous amount of financial resources to the university. Something on the order of 65 to 70% of the funds came from the taxpayer. Today it's under 10%. And so that's driven tuition and fees up dramatically and created an environment where it's harder for the federal aid programs to fill that gap.
I want to come back to the history on this in a second, because I think that's really interesting. But I didn't give you a chance to take a step back and just say, in terms of this Democratic presidential candidate proposal that's out there, free college for all, which has a beautiful kind of, peace, bread, land sort of ring to it. Where do you stand on at least what Sanders and Warren are putting out there?
So where I am right now is that I believe that every student graduating from high school today should have a free public option. And that free public option should be something that is of their choosing, not a decision by the state. So if their choice, if their desire is to get an associate's degree or certificate that's occupationally focused, community college is great for them. If they want to go to a research university, they should have that option. But the public system should be free. And that is very different from what we have today, but it is very similar to what we had historically.
My understanding of the overlap between Sandy and Max here is that, because they did say some different things, but one area where they agreed was that this is kind of a give back to the rich kids. So what do you say to that?
So the give back to the rich kids started in my estimate when we began to use tax credits to subsidize higher education for upper income families. So we've been doing that since the Clinton administration, really to try to make access more accessible across the board by giving that benefit. What I would say is that we could do a better job assuring access and making sure that access is meaningful for all students by using the public institutions to really drive the policy, rather than be worrying about over-subsidizing the more affluent students. At the end of the day, more affluent students that choose to are going to go to private institutions anyway.
Go ahead.
Can I just say, so the thing about, some people say, well, look, K-12 education is free and nobody's proposing putting tuition and fees on that and everybody gets it. We don't require everybody to graduate from high school, but we do require everybody to participate in most of the high school education. I don't think we're going to start requiring people to go to college anytime soon. Maybe eventually we will do that. And if you look at participation in post-secondary education, low-income students disproportionately go to community colleges and get those associate degrees and certificates. And that may be the right thing for them to do. Higher income students disproportionately enroll in the flagship universities that are much more expensive to operate. They stay there for a longer time. They get much more, they consume much more higher education, and it's not just because of the price. As I said, many low-income students can go for free, even if they don't know it. We have a society that is so unequal that what happens is that many students don't graduate from high school. They graduate from high school totally unprepared to do college-level work. They grew up in unhealthy neighborhoods. They grew up with families where they suffered from unemployment and in bad housing and bad health care and everything else, and making college free is not going to solve their problems. I want to make sure we do something about all of those problems so that there really is equal opportunity to take advantage of higher education. And I think free college is going to direct resources in the wrong direction to accomplish that.
Was I right, Max, in saying that you agree with most of this, or where do you part ways with Sandy on this?
No, I think Sandy and I are substantively economically on the same page, if not quite culturally so. I'd counter David's, I think, somewhat blithe assumption that if public university were free, upper class students would still go to private universities. I mean, my sample size of 1, grew up in a very nice, affluent suburb. Graduating class went either to private university or to state school, largely a function of parental wealth. If everybody that I went to high school with would have been able to go to Ohio State for free, they would have all gone to Ohio State for free. If as part of the accountability system that's sure to come with free college, because we can't just throw money away and not want results, colleges like Ohio State are going to want to increase their graduation rates. How do you increase graduation rates? You take kids who are more predisposed to succeed. So I think that you would see a massive shift in middle income, upper middle income students away from private universities to public colleges, which would come at a cost to students who could be coming there from a less advantaged background. I also think that price, although not always synonymous with quality, can sometimes be. There was a study in Massachusetts when that state looked at the top 2 deciles, gave free college to all students who graduated top 20% of their class, free public university. They found that a whole bunch of students who would have gone to private colleges went to public colleges that were in many cases of lower quality, and actually graduation rates for those students decreased. So to the extent that you encourage flight from private universities to public universities from advantaged students, you're hurting low-income students. To the extent that you do that from disadvantaged students, you might actually be hurting them as well.
And the data on this flight that you're talking about, I mean, how robust is it really, besides your sample size of 1?
Oh, it's largely anecdotal. I mean, just like we haven't seen this play out, and you can't really gesture at things that are kind of towards this and extrapolate to what would be a fundamental sea change.
Because just to flip it on its head,
yeah.
I'm also a sample size of 1.
Yeah.
And I got a free ride to the University of Nebraska. My father's a carpenter, and I went to Yale instead.
Yeah.
And that's one of the reasons why I'm sitting here and not tearing the roofs off houses, because this is when you do it in Nebraska. And so beyond that sort of, because it makes intuitive sense to me that you would choose the free option, but not everybody does, clearly. Do we know anything more about the behavior of students on this question? Is this something you've ever looked at, either of you?
We know this Massachusetts study, which is not a national study, it did have these results. Let me just say that Yale is not representative of private colleges, and there are many families who will pay for Yale, but they're not going to pay for most private colleges, which have higher graduation rates marginally maybe, but certainly don't get you onto this stage.
Well, and I think that, and I think that your point about accountability systems is really important. That you have to build with this system, a free college, however it is formulated by whatever presidential candidate, is that you have to really fundamentally rethink the way we do accountability in higher education in general, relying on accrediting agencies that use peer review really doesn't get us where we need to be. When you're talking about this kind of systemic reform, what I've said is that in writing that I've done, both at the center and in a book published by Johns Hopkins Press, Accreditation on the Edge. In that, I make the argument that, you know, the first order assessment of what should be required is access and affordability. And that you then moved into measures of other measures of quality, like graduation rates and long-term economic returns. But the fundamental first measure is, are you, and this is knowable, you can evaluate whether or not an institution is providing access to all socioeconomic status, race, ethnicity within a geographic area. And that's a fairly easy, straightforward thing to measure that you could build into an accountability system.
Well, and the affordability question that you bring up, I think, is an interesting one, because you mentioned earlier this idea of free or almost free college is not pulled out of the blue. I mean, there have been some precedents for this before. I mean, the University of Florida didn't start charging tuition until 1969. The UC system back in 1868, the decree that created it said that admission and tuition shall be free to all residents of the state. And they had fees of various kinds that accrued over the years, but even as late as 1970, the total was only $150, which, I mean, if you adjust for inflation, that's about $1,000, but still. Yeah. So what happened? How did we get to a point where free college sounds like such a crazy idea?
So there's one cultural answer, which is we decided that higher education was a private good, not a public one. And you can go back to California, you can go back to the Reagan being governor, where there was a lot, where he posited this idea that the government stood between people and their dreams, and that over support of the public higher education system in California was symptomatic of that. Now, I think that's kind of upside down. I thought it was upside down at the time, but that, you know, kind of got into our culture as he was governor, and then later as he became president. I have another theory about it that has to do with student loans, but we can talk about that when we get to student loans.
So let me say, first of all, I don't know how many people in the room are economists, but the public good, private good thing, it always is very hard for me to hear it described that way, because it's very clear that higher education is not a public good the way national defense is a public good. There are capacity constraints. If I go to Yale, you can't go to Yale. And there are clear public benefits to higher education. It is very clear that the students get a huge share of the benefits of their education, but the society also shares in those benefits. So this is not an either-or sort of situation. It is totally reasonable for students to pay some fraction of their education, because not only do they tend to come from more affluent backgrounds, but they're going to end up being well off financially after they go to college. Most of them are. Not all of them, but most of them are. So they get a big benefit from that investment in themselves. They should pay for part of it. The debate is how much of it should they pay for, and there's not a right answer to that. But you know, we used to make college much cheaper when only a small share of people went to college, and mostly only people whose families could afford to send them to college went to college. We were perfectly happy that people from low-income backgrounds really didn't go to college very often. Now, we would really like to let everybody go to college who can benefit from it. That is a much more expensive undertaking, and I think people don't want to pay for those people's kids to go to college, and so the willingness to pay taxes has really diminished in terms of supporting higher education. That's a huge problem. But making it free is a lot easier when a small share of people go to college than it is when it's something that we're really trying to give to everyone, and the share of people going to college has risen dramatically.
I wanted to ask you, Max, given that from your perspective, you make a coherent case for why free college for all sounds like kind of a crazy idea now. What is your assessment of why it seemed less crazy back then?
It served less people, and it was less expensive and less costly. I mean, you have a smaller product that serves fewer people. It's not that crazy that it'd be free. Part of the question is, why did costs increase? And you know, David gave one explanation that's very frequently put out that a lot of it's state disinvestment, the state level, they scaled back, partly because they were fine with the federal government paying more. Over the course of time, you find higher private funding, lower public funding, and this increases overall costs. Another hypothesis that's put forward frequently that's not always in tension, but is kind of frequently pitted against is the Bennett Hypothesis, right? When the federal government basically said to colleges, we're going to hand out a whole bunch of loans, do you want free money, and what are you going to do with it? Colleges thought, oh, okay, so we can now charge people $15,000 rather than $7,000. Yeah, we'll do that, and we'll build everything else in our cost structure around the assumption that we're going to have an extra 50% of money per student. You do that for long enough, you let these institutions operate without any cost constraint, they get extremely expensive, and the notion that they could be free actually starts to be daunting.
The Bennett hypothesis, though, presumes that the supply of college is highly inelastic. It's sort of based on this idea that college is something like a lot closer to real estate in Manhattan than it is to shoes or something. And I'm wondering, as an economist, is this something you've ever looked at?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is strong evidence that in the for-profit sector, there is a powerful relationship between federal student aid and the prices that these institutions charge. They get most of their revenue from federal student aid, and therefore it's highly associated. The evidence, there are lots of empirical studies of this, and mostly, you know, one study will say, well, only the tuition and fees at public four-year colleges, and another will say only the room and board at private four-year colleges. There's very inconsistent evidence. It seems pretty, I mean, reasonable that there would be some upward pressure on prices, sticker prices, not necessarily the prices students pay. There are lots of other reasons that the cost of producing education has gone up. We're producing a very different product than we were producing a generation ago. We are educating students who face lots of difficulties that they didn't face before. The students are demanding all kinds of things, not just what goes on in the classroom. We need computers, so there are lots of reasons. The cost of educating students have gone up, not just the price. I mean, so it's not just about state subsidy. That's a piece of it. It's lots more, but the evidence, I think, is that the federal student aid, I wouldn't say the impact is zero, but that is not the explanation, and it certainly hasn't counteracted the effectiveness of federal student aid in lowering the prices that many students pay.
I want to take a step back from it for a second, because I do think this is an interesting thing. As a layperson who came into this to research it, it surprised me, the findings of economists like you. And I would also have to add that it's not as if there's total agreement on this question, right? And so the case, as Max laid it out in simpler terms, is sort of economics 101. You raise the amount of money available to buy a thing, the thing gets more expensive. And so what is, put into similarly stupid language, what is the explanation for why that Econ 101 analysis from the Bennett hypothesis doesn't apply to college?
Well, I'm not an economist, so I'll try my
Then
lay.
we'll let Sandy
Yeah, then
she is.
tell me
Okay.
she'll tell me I'm wrong. No, the difference is that there are limits on the amount of money that you can get from federal sources. There's a limit on an annual limit of your Pell Grant award that's been going up, but not even at the same rate as overall inflation. And the loan limits for student loans were capped way back in 2008-ish. So, 11 years ago. So it's not like there's more money you can get from federal programs today. Little footnote asterisk about plus loans that Sandy will probably yell at us about.
No, I mean, I think that's
Again,
really-
if you're explaining it to the fourth graders in the room, who there are none, but there's maybe, just pretend it's me.
Yeah, but you explained part of it, which has to do with the supply. Could we enroll more students? Or is it just that there's a fixed amount and everybody wants to pay more for it? But we obviously have increased the supply. I mean, the number of students we are educating now is much, much higher. But it's also true that there are two prices we're talking about. One is the sticker price, and one is the price that students pay. And if you give a student a $6,000 Pell Grant, suppose it caused the tuition price, I mean, I don't think this is the case, but to go up by $1,000. So then it would be true, it put upward pressure on the price, but they got a $6,000 Pell Grant that they wouldn't otherwise have gotten, so they are paying less. The student who didn't get any financial aid may be paying a little bit more, but the students who are getting it are paying a lot less. And part of what we're doing with the federal student aid system is charging different prices to different students. And I mean, I have to say, I mean, I think people are okay with some upward pressure on the price, the sticker price, in the interest of making sure. The whole goal here is that more people will be able to pay for a college education. That is our goal. And so, but you're right, it's not like here it is and you know, the demand curve just goes up and we charge higher prices. It doesn't work that way. We are educating lots more people.
Since we've started talking about financial aid, let's talk about financial aid. That was the next thing I was going to get to, and you've run ahead. So, student loan debt. This is another thing that's coming up a lot, especially among the Democratic candidates. Senator Sanders has proposed forgiving $1.6 trillion in all existing student loans. We'll get to Warren's plan in a second if we have time, but let's start with Bernie because he's simplest. What do we think of this? Good? Bad? Crazy? Max, why don't you start?
Let's ask the audience. How many of you guys think that we should forgive all student loans? Wow, you're pretty out of step with the polls, I will say. How many of you guys think that
Four
we
of
should...
you, though. Four.
Four.
Yeah.
How many of you guys think that we should forgive all mortgage loans? One. Why would we not forgive all mortgage loans? Well, for one thing, you could kind of divide America into classes, right? There's the owning class and there's the renting class. The owning class is substantially wealthier than the renting class, and the people who have the biggest mortgages have the most expensive homes, have the highest economic prospects. It would then be extremely regressive to take money from a bunch of people who are renting and just plow it into people who are owning, because they are not only more wealthy, but they'll also be able to parlay that into ever more wealth, and they have the most secure economic position possibly imaginable. Same thing with student loans, right? There are kind of two classes of people in America. There are people with college degrees and without. All the free college rhetoric serves to heighten this kind of fundamental class distinction in America. And so why would we take money effectively from people who we probably should be giving money to, people who are not economically secure, and giving it to people like me who went to Yale? And I would love to have, you pay me $50,000. I would love that. I would love to go to AOC's district and ask her constituents to fund my college retrospectively. But that's really deeply regressive.
In the interest of contrast, David, what's your take on forgiving the student debt?
And I have come a long way in my thinking on this, and it certainly has evolved, and I have come down on the side of we should forgive it all. I come down the side of forgive it all for a couple of reasons. One is that I think that young adults are the ones who are most likely to spend the money that they have in their pockets, and so it has the greatest stimulative effect on the economy and when you need it. And so rather than giving a $1 trillion tax cut to people like me, we should have forgiven the student loans. The second reason is that I think fundamentally we can't get to anything approaching a more equitable higher education system if we don't deal with it. Because you've got, the issue we have is generational, not class. There's the generation that I represent, the baby boomers, who pretty much had the public system paying for it, and then you have and as you move forward in time to the generation that my daughter represents, where they have now taken on these enormous amounts of student loan debt. Not my daughter. She couldn't take out a student loan because I would have had to recuse myself in my federal job for a lot of what I did, because it would have been a conflict of interest. Put that in the.
That doesn't stop everybody,
It does not, but the ethics officers at the department.
It was another time.
It was a different time. But a lot of nearly all of her peers are hugely indebted in a way that none of us that were well, none of us at my age would have ever been required to be indebted in order for them to get a college degree. And so I think that there's a generational inequity that we've created. And the final thing is the whole student loan system was a social experiment gone wrong.
So, forgive me if I'm summarizing too much, but it sounds like kind of a social case that you're making as much as anything else. And I'm wondering, what is the economic case?
So, I mean, there are a couple of points that I think it's really important to understand. I mean, one is, like, if you said to me, should we be thinking about the people who are really struggling in our society and whether, in fact, we should be designing some sort of you could call it a handout, some sort of a subsidy to people because they are unable to make ends meet and they have really not been treated fairly by this economy and so on, I would say, I think that's an interesting idea and maybe we should do that. But let's talk about who's going to get that subsidy. Okay, first thing, if you didn't go to college, you don't get any money. Who would say, oh, that's a good idea? Nobody would say that, right? But that's what this plan is. I would say, you know, medical debt is also very concentrated among young people because they're more likely to be uninsured and so on. I don't think anybody should have to borrow for medical care. And if you proposed forgiving medical debt, and Bernie Sanders has now added that to his proposal, I would say, you know, I think we should think about that because I don't think anybody should actually be having to pay medical debt. Student debt, a huge amount of student debt is held by people who went to graduate school. Graduate students are borrowing more and more and more. On average, a graduate student borrows about 3 times as much per year as an undergraduate student. So lots of that debt out there is people who went to law school and medical school and so on. And a very large share of the debt is held by a few people. Most people owe a little bit of money. Most of the people who default don't owe much money. We have in place a federal student loan repayment system, which needs to be strengthened and improved, but that protects people who cannot afford to make their payments. If you cannot afford to repay your federal student debt, we will not require you to pay it back, and we will eventually forgive it. I think that's a really, really important thing to do. I don't think we have to also say, if you can afford to pay it, we're going to forgive it anyway. I think we should worry about the people for whom education has not paid off well, but worrying about all those doctors and lawyers is not the point. We need resources to be more equitably distributed, and we need resources to make sure that more people can get a high-quality education in the future.
You know, Betsy DeVos was on Bret Baier's show on Fox News yesterday, and there's one way that her remarks actually overlapped with yours, which was she said the forgive the debt proposal is asking the 2/3 of America who didn't go to college to pay for the 1/3 who did. And when you put it that way, it seems a pretty tough sell.
I'm not excited to agree with her, but I have to say that, you know.
I'm glad I'm where I am, that's all I'll say.
Max, you wrote something recently that was very interesting about, you talked about how the media likes to run story after story about struggling student loan borrowers, how they owing more than $100,000 in debt, and you said, while the individual stories were true, the narrative they built was fake. Can you explain what you meant by that?
Yeah, I think a lot of reporters at places like the New York Times talk to their friends who got degrees from Yale, from Columbia, who have $150,000 in debt and are working $60,000 jobs and think, oh my God, this is really bad. My friend's in a really rough position. But, you know, that is not a representative sample of the condition of the American people. I think Sandy might be able to pull the numbers out perhaps faster than I, but it's an extremely small portion of debtors that have this $100,000 debt to begin with. Many of them have it because they went to medical school, in which case they'll be making mid-6 figures, so that's their lives. Law school, in which case, depending on the law school, they will, they won't be. They're the people with the highest economic prospects who tend to have the largest debts. And so what we see represented is a small share of people who have a lot of debt from a prestigious university and have chosen to not pursue a really economically remunerative career path. And that shouldn't be the North Star of social policy making.
But when the narrative in the news about student loans is sort of discussed, this $1.6 trillion in debt gets thrown around as sort of the ultimate proof that there is a crisis facing us. And I'm wondering, does the sheer aggregate amount of the student loan debt held by American students. Is that actually a cause for concern? Sandy?
No, I mean, I think we need to worry about the students who borrow more than it's worth borrowing for the education that they're getting and who won't be able to afford it. I mean, that's a big problem. But one point, I mean, it's once we got past $1 trillion, people started talking about this number. Nobody ever talked about it before. It's just a big number. But it's both students borrowing more and more people borrowing. It's not like the housing crisis. I mean, it's a tiny amount. We're not going to have, you know, a big bubble bursting or the credit markets crashing because people don't pay back their federal student loans. We need to worry about students borrowing. There are many, too many students borrowing for education that doesn't pay off. Some students are borrowing too much. Most students are borrowing moderately and are really able to pay it back. So I think we should focus on the individual students. We should focus on students who do not complete college. They have the most trouble repaying their loans. We should focus on why African American students are borrowing so much more and having so much more trouble repaying than other students, and we should focus on the for-profit colleges where students are borrowing a lot of money and not graduating. Let's fix those very serious, very real problems, but that's not really about the $1.6 trillion.
And if these stories about the philosophy student who owes $100,000 and is stuck working at Arby's are outliers, then what does the actual real average picture of student loan debt look like, and is that number scary?
The average amount of student loan debt is around $27,000 today.
For bachelor's degree,
For bachelor's, which is still the primary pool of loans, and that is not, and ought not to be that scary a number.
If you get your degree.
If you get your degree. I do agree with Sandy that if somebody said, well, what's the one thing you could do? I'd go and say we should forgive the debt for the people who defaulted on student loans when they didn't have access to income-driven repayment plans. And there are about 7 million of those people. If I could do only one thing, and that is the one group of people nobody cares about, except maybe Sandy and I. Because they're the people who didn't graduate, they're the people who graduated but life circumstance led them into careers that didn't reward them for the amount of debt they took on, and a variety of other things that happened.
We're going to open it up to questions in a second, but before we do that, I just wanted to return to Max's secret plan to blow up college. It actually ties in nicely with the last thing I wanted to talk about, which is, aside from the student loan debt crisis narrative that's in the news a lot, there is a larger crisis narrative that is often associated with coverage of college. And it's this idea that, college is getting more expensive, it's getting worse, and it might not even really be worth it in the first place. And maybe this growing expense is driven by waste in the academy. I mean, it's a cluster of stories, but it adds up to this idea. If you follow news coverage as a layperson about college, it sounds like the system is about to break and it doesn't work. And I just wanted to know, to what extent do you think, is that getting anything right? Is that not getting it right at all? Because I think that this sense is driving some of the sense of urgency in policy discussions.
So I think talking about college without differentiating doesn't get us very far. There are thousands of colleges and universities, post-secondary institutions in this country. And, I don't think that Yale and Columbia are about to collapse. I mean, they are not perfect, and we could wish that they did some things differently, but people are going to still be willing to pay for them. I hope the prices go up more slowly. There are many institutions in this country, many of them for-profit, but not all of them. Some of them private, nonprofit, some of them public, where 10% of the students ever graduate and get any kind of a degree. That's a huge problem. So, but saying that college is not going well, it just doesn't make any sense. I mean, on average, the return to a college education remains very high, and it improves people's lives dramatically, and I don't think the evidence is very good that it turns everybody into radical, whatever. So saying college is broken, to me, makes no sense at all. Saying we're not doing a good job of regulating and holding institutions accountable, that's really true. We need to hold institutions accountable. We are giving too many federal dollars to students to enroll in institutions that won't serve them well, but that's because we're choosing not to regulate and not to hold institutions accountable. That's not because the idea of college is wrong and nobody should get a bachelor's degree or anything like that. And all the people who say that are absolutely going to send their kids to expensive colleges.
Let me adopt your framing for a moment. If we talk about the students who owe approximately 30 grand for their undergraduate degree, and they're going to, if you're talking about most students in America, they go to a state school, is that investment worth it? And I'll ask you first because you raised the sort of darkest questions, Max, about whether or not college is worth it in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, for those students, that is worth it. As there's a big open question as to whether or not that being worth it is a function of them learning a lot in college that makes them much more economically successful, or whether it's a function of them being a person who has a bachelor's degree, which allows them to go through life in contradistinction to those who don't, right? How much of this is educational, economic value add, and how much of this is signaling? There was a book that came out last year, got a lot of criticism, a lot of debate. I don't know the literature enough to evaluate it fully. The case against college basically positing it's all signaling. There's very little economic value being added through college. Primarily, it's a way to distinguish yourself over somebody else, which means that it ends up being a zero-sum game. You know, you get into a position where if you want to be a janitor, you have to have a master's because that's the best way for somebody who runs a janitorial program to figure out who's reliable. It's the person with a master's degree because they've shown up for all that time. Not that they've learned all these things that will make them a great janitor, but that they've been able to come up through a system that's primary function is saying, okay, you are better than you based maybe more in pre-existing qualities than in that. So, you know, would I send my kid to a 4 years bachelor degree? Absolutely, because that'd be a great benefit for him. I'd be silly not to. Am I confident that if that proxy for quality didn't exist, that my kid would have to attend a college in order to be economically successful? Not as much.
In terms of moving people up the economic ladder, then, is it still a good investment? Is it the only horse in the corral?
It really is. I mean, if you look at what happens to people who start out in the lower half of the income distribution, if you get a bachelor's degree, you have a very good chance of moving up. If you don't have a good chance of moving up. So, you know, all this discussion about, you know, why are there not more low-income students at Columbia, we can talk about that. But that doesn't mean that an individual student shouldn't go to Columbia if given the opportunity or get a bachelor's degree somewhere. Of course, many low-income students are getting sub-baccalaureate degrees, certificates and associate degrees. Some of them pay off very well, some of them don't. And so we have to be careful about saying, oh, just go to college, doesn't matter where you go, it doesn't matter what you do, because that's not true, because there are some college credentials that do not pay off well for students.
No, I think that's absolutely true that there are some programs that are offered by for-profit colleges, public colleges, nonprofits that just don't pay economically, but overall, you know, you really don't have any other alternative if you want, your kids, your grandkids to move into the middle class. It's necessary in our economy, and there are real structural reasons why that is true. It's not just because I don't think it's just a signaling. I think it's fundamental reality of the nature of the change in our economy. There are fewer and fewer jobs that don't require some education beyond high school.
It's likely I've talked too much. So if anyone has any questions, we'd like to open up the last bit of this for questions.
Hi, this has been very interesting. This is not quite the spirit of the Green New Deal and, you know, helping poor people necessarily, but when you look at, you know, a selective but not necessarily elite bachelor's degree, fully loaded, can be approaching, you know, $250,000 or something like that. You know, Oxford and Cambridge in the UK, they're not going anywhere. So, you know, let's assume the Ivies and pick a number, the top 20 colleges, they're equally not going anywhere. There will be plenty of rich people to pay the full freight. What is the future of private college ranked, say, you know, 21 through 50, 21 through 100? Does it make sense that college has, for reasons we've talked about, gotten as expensive as it has, and I think the middle class in this country is basically under pressure. Is it sustainable? Are we going to see, the same number of private colleges as we see today?
I think we're going to see a substantial decline in the number of private colleges, particularly in the Northeast. But they're not in the ones that are in the rank between 21 and 100. They're in the rank that are between 800 and 1,500, right? That we have in the United States, we have lots of public colleges. Public 4 years, about 596, couple of thousand community colleges, but I don't remember the number off the top of my head correctly, but it's in excess of 3,000 private, nonprofit colleges in the United States. And that's way too many. And they tend to be very small, and they lack economies of scale, and all it takes is one president that doesn't know what they're doing, and they kill it. And it could have been tremendous quality 2 years before that president arrived, and they can kill it in 2 years. And we've seen it happen.
Next question. We're just in the interest of getting the questions along. I'm going to try.
Hi. Okay. So first of all, I'm very nervous. So if I scramble, sorry. But I guess to Max's point about comparing paying for student loans is like paying for a mortgage. If you think about student loans and education being a basic right, so there's a difference between a choice versus a basic right. And education should be thought about as a basic right. Mortgage, that's a choice. I should have the right to have access to higher education without loans or debt so that I have the choice to be able to take out a mortgage. Right now, a lot of millennials are dealing with a lot of debt. I can't be an active member of our society and our economy if I have loans. I cannot spend as much. I cannot participate in our economy as much. I think about the cost of children and taking out a mortgage, for instance. So I envision a world where I should have the ability to go to any school that I want to, whether it be public or private, despite the cost. This is an access argument. If I am accepted to a top-tier school, I should be able to make a choice that isn't dependent on college costs and calculating debt.
I'm just going to ask, just in the interest of as many people as possible talking, if you could come to the question.
The question?
Yeah, thanks a
No,
lot.
the question is right now. So the way I think about it is, I don't know why the discussion hasn't gone around talking about free education for the middle and poor class. It's right now about everybody. And so I guess my question to you is, why hasn't this been proposed? And what are the kind of the financial capacities or incapabilities of something, of a system that looks like that?
What would it look like to have free education that's targeted at people who can't afford it?
For middle class, yeah, for people who can't afford it.
So we have a Pell Grant program, which is targeted at low and moderate income students and gives grants depending on how much money you have. It should be more generous, it's not enough, but in fact, as I said before, at public institutions, many low-income students do not pay tuition because they get federal grants and state grants and institutional grants. So we do that, and we could make those grant programs more generous, and it could be tuition-free for all of those people. A very big problem is, how do you live when you're in college, right? And it's like, if you don't have a full-time job, how are you going to pay for your food and your housing and so on? Unfortunately, many people in our society who do not have adequate labor market earnings do struggle with how to pay for food and housing. I don't think anybody should be struggling with how to pay for food and housing, whether they are enrolled in college or whether they're not enrolled in college, and we need to strengthen the social support programs. But if you go to college and get a bachelor's degree and you had to borrow $30,000 to do it, in 2 or 3 years, your after-tax income will more than make up. You could pay that whole thing back and be better off than somebody who didn't go to college. You can afford some debt. We could have much higher taxes, but if we have higher taxes, instead of paying off your loans, you're going to pay those higher taxes when you finish college. So somehow we have to figure out how to pay for this, and certainly you should be able to access whatever education you can benefit from, but the idea that we're going to make it free for people to go to Yale and the taxpayers are going to pay for that, knowing where they're going to end up afterwards, is just not about access and equity.
Anything further? All right. Next question, please.
Hi. I wanted to dive a little bit deeper in these issues of cost and quality, and especially with these kind of innovative ideas like University of Purdue, for example, is like piloting this income sharing agreements that are differentiated based off of major and things of that nature. I want to hear your thoughts on those ideas. And in regards to cost, I think the latest crosshairs has been the admin to student ratio, which I believe is 1 to 30 at public universities. And even Yang and others have talked about cutting this to 1 to 21, tying that to some certain incentives. Would that actually reduce the cost of college? Would this be good policy on any of those fronts? Thank you.
So, dealing with the second question first, you know, when you look at the studies that have been done about what drives cost of education as opposed to price of education, you know, the current conversations around are really focused on this issue of administrative costs. And the evidence is, I would say, kind of still weak in my estimate. A lot of what shows up in the data on administrative costs are things that could just as easily be included in student support. You know, Sandy made mention of this, you know, the things that students increasingly need to be successful, you know, are the kind of things that are not easy to quantify, to decide where to place on the ledger sheet as to what those services represent, because they're relatively new things to show up on campuses related to health, mental health, and other kinds of support in that area, or also, you know, technological support. So those are the kinds of things. I'll let somebody else try the first half of the question.
Yeah, I think the Mitch Daniels Purdue piece is more interesting for the bit of it that's not the income share agreements, right? Income share agreements are interesting for those who aren't familiar. It's more of an equity than a debt model. You basically say, I'm going to give you 5% of my income for the next 15 years in exchange for my education, rather than saying I'm taking out this big share of capital that I will pay off. And so what that does quite nicely is it shifts risk. It shifts risks from the student to the institution. And so you don't, you know, you'll be in a position where you could get a very expensive education but never worry about not being able to be dragged down by a catastrophe and not being able to make ends meet, because it will always be a certain share of what you do. But the more interesting thing here, I think, is that Mitch Daniels is a extremely smart, effective manager. And he said, we're not going to raise tuition, and he has not raised tuition. It can be done. Most colleges have absolutely no reason to. They have every incentive to spend as much money as they can, take in as much money as they can, charge as much as they can get away with. I think that the Purdue Daniels example shows that if you have a leader who's actually interested in running an effective organization, it can be run that way.
And because we've run over time, I think we're going to have to end it there. My job was sort of two things: to not accidentally say swear words and end on time. I've succeeded on the first count, but not on the second. But thank you all for your attention, and thank you to our panelists for your expertise. And I hope they invite me back.